We're really passionate about the power that good food can do, right? Like, so on the back of our jug, we have a quote that says, when you eat good food, you connect to the land. We exist to help you connect to the land, right?
Okay.
When you eat good food, you can taste it and you know that it has a real story behind it that connects to people and land and community.
Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more. This has been an awesome visit so far. So we are at Baird Farm maple syrup here in Vermont. I'm here with Jacob. What's so awesome was you're clearly so freaking knowledgeable and passionate about all this through the tour, and I learned a hell of a lot through that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm glad you came to the farm. My name's Jacob Powsner. I'm a co-owner, and I'm not a Baird of Baird Farm. So Jenna and I are part of the fourth generation of this farm. And I was joking earlier, they mostly tolerate me here on most days. And so it's a family farm that's in transition. But Jenna and I help run the 15,000 tap maple operation here. And we spend a lot of time sharing stories and educating the public around maple syrup and what we do. So it's great to have you come and have this conversation.
I guess with that, what would be your favorite story to share to whenever people come and visit? Do you have one that, they just go to?
I don't know. We covered some of this when we walked down to the trees, right? Some people really want to know about the history of family farming and the history of sugaring. And some people don't. Some people are really interested in health and nutrition or the science of sugaring. But I think a lot of people really connect with like how long the family has been sugaring on this property and the history and the legacy of family farming. And so that's pretty important and integral to our story here. So I was saying before, this farm really paid its bills milking cows for the past 107 years. And the sugaring was always a side hustle. But what's happened in the past 20 years is the side hustle has become the main hustle. So we still have cattle on the farm, but we really pay our bills making and selling maple syrup here. And so that's been a huge thing that we've all kind of intentionally leaned in towards the maple industry.
And then I guess just going back to the first time do you remember the first time you came over here? How long ago was that?
Shannon and I met in high school orchestra. So she's a cello player and I'm an upright bassist. And so it was kind of like a lower strings romance, if you know what I mean. So I've known the Bairds a long, long time. And I feel like I volunteered here for some events early on, but just in terms of like the relationship to the production end of the farm. We throw and still throw a maple open house weekend in Vermont. So thousands of people come here every year. But that weekend, I think this past year, there was maybe 1,000 people that came. But back in the day, I came here in the early 2000s, and you hand out samples, and you scoop ice cream, and you feed people pickles. It's a traditional thing we didn't talk about this, but it's a traditional thing to have pickles in between tasting the different grades of syrup.
Is that because of the vinegar of the pickle?
Yeah, it's something about like cleansing the palate. Sometimes people do potato chips too, but I don't really do potato chips.
Interesting. So then also, I know we talked more on the history of it all as we were walking around this farm, but now that we're sitting down, because with the fact that this was established around 1918, if we could just talk a little bit about the backstory of Baird to where now we're sitting here in 2025.
Sure. Yeah, it's a big history. So Jenna's great-grandmother, Sarah, bought this farm from her sister, Nora. They don't talk about Nora a lot. I don't know what happened to Nora, but I don't think she did anything bad. But they split a farm in two. And so the one sister got one half and the other sister got the other half. And back then, it was a lot more like subsistence kind of farming. They made butter and they sold it door to door in the local town, Rutland. And after that, they sent cans of milk on a train that went from Pittsford to Boston every day. And then after that, they sold to Hood Dairy for a while. And we sold to Cabot for many, many years. If you know, like the big blocks of the extra sharp cheddar cheese is what they're known for. And all the while, like Jenna's great-grandmother, they made maple syrup early in the season. If you were good at making sugar, you could get a paycheck early in the season. Lots of folks just did it as like a family activity or a hobby that became bigger than a hobby. Like if you were good at it, you could make more than just Christmas presents. You could sell some jugs of syrup on the side. And that continued through World War I, World War II, post-World War. And then Jenna's grandfather started building more sugaring. And then Jenna's dad is the one who really, really loved sugaring. And he met a lot of his goals with the dairy. And so they sold the dairy herd. And then we raised dairy heifers for many years. And by the time Jenna and I returned to this farm from working on farms out west, it was 2015. We were having dairy heifers from other farms pasture this land. But Bob wanted to build more and more maple. So the story of this farm in the past 10 years is we've doubled in just production and how much maple we make. But we also sell direct to consumer way more jugged syrup than ever before.
So going to the doubling of the production, is that from just laying a really solid foundation to, I guess, were you able to double that production in such a short amount of time?
Well, you need to find the trees. And so sugar makers like us are always looking at trees. Like when we're walking through the woods, I found a couple trees.
Were you just marking them in your head?
Yeah. So, but the big story here is that the maple industry is doing well, which is comparatively a success story. In the world of agriculture, where a lot of ag is doing really poorly, the economics are broken, maple has quintupled in size in the past 20 years. So it's a bonkers amount of growth. And you have really big maple farms coming in. But if you always made maple syrup, you're trying to tap more trees because like you can make maple syrup more efficiently than ever before. You can manage larger and larger swaths of woodlands with less humans than ever before, making higher yields. And the financing structures have gotten better. So like if you came here in the 80s and you wanted to tap Nick Wocket, that hill up past our hill, and you wrote a little budget out on a piece of paper and you took it to the banker, they would laugh at you because, I mean, you seem like a reputable guy, but like sugaring was a risky thing that like woodsy people did on the side. It wasn't a business. But now more lenders are more eager to finance maple farms. So here we built out a whole bush behind us, a sugar bush for the stand where the maple trees are. And we added, because we started leasing land over the mountain, right? A lot of maple farms lease land. And so we found trees over the mountain that we could connect to easily to pump over the mountain.
Dang.
Yeah.
And then, okay.
There's a lot there.
How do you whenever you had just the crazy up with all that, how do you manage? Because it seems like it's super labor intensive as you grow and find more trees, because then that just means you have to go out and check more and more.
Yeah.
Or cover more and more surface area. So how are you able to manage all of that while the actual business side of everything?
Yeah. Barely. It's the answer.
Barely.
Barely. So there's a lot there in terms of like how best practices in terms of management, right? There's always a bottleneck to some operation, right? Whether it's labor or whether it's your equipment, whether it's the size of your tractor or whether it's the amount of acreage that you have to till or maintain. With us, we have the right amount of equipment so we can continue to grow a little bit before we would have to do really large capital investments. And so it's pretty easy to boil in a little bit more sap for us. Maple, like many industries, has a thing called economies of scale, right? So generally speaking, if you can do, and this is why we end up partially with commercialized corporatized agriculture in America, if you can do more things, it becomes cheaper to do the same amount of things or more things. Does that make sense?
It does.
Right? So here we have grown, like Bob had one person helping him in the woods back in the day. Now there's at least 4 of us-ish that make all the maple syrup on this farm. So maybe like just to paint a picture for folks that are just listening to the podcast, every year here we tap trees. We drill about 15,000 holes into trees in the dead of winter. Every year we pound spouts into those trees that are hooked up to a tubing system, and we move sap that is very watery from trees to a building where eventually we process and filter and boil 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 it down into a thick, delicious syrup. That happens really in the month of March. And then we go back to all those trees. We yank all the spouts out of the trees, and then we hug them. Practice gratitude.
So what happens if you don't take those out in time?
Well, sometimes you'll see like an abandoned sugar bush where the spouts are still on the trees in the heat of summer. It's not good for the trees, right? So best practices, like we're certified organic on our farm, which we can pull apart, but I have more rules when it comes to all of these things around tree health. I want to yank all the spouts within a couple weeks of our last boil. And that way the tree will heal over most efficiently and have it. Otherwise it'll look like if you've ever seen like a fence line grow into a tree, like a barbed wire fence grow into a tree, the tree will just swallow up that spout, whether it's metal or plastic or whatnot. And
so then on the organic, is the qualifications and whatnot different than say, a farm that's just growing corn and other produce?
Yeah, so like, as you're familiar with, there's all sorts of different crops that have all sorts of different standards and certifications. The national organic standard, right, has different rules when it comes to growing vegetables, to dairying, to let's say maple. With maple is half the rules have to do with what we talk about when we talk about the woods. So what we would call forest management practices, tapping guidelines, biodiversity threshold indexes in the woods, all of these things we get annually inspected on that are supposed to promote healthy, sustainable woodlands. At the end of the day, before it got corporatized, the organic program was all about healthy soils. Now you can have hydroponic berry farms and still be certified organic. That's a deeper conversation. But the other half of what it means to be organic with maple has to do with what happens inside the sugar house, which is right across the way through the window. That's products we use when we clean tanks and filters, defoamers, which we didn't talk about, but defoamers are used in maple syrup.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So when sugar boils, it foams. And it'll boil right over the pans, right? There's a lot of foam pressure, and folks might know this if they've ever made jams or jellies or beer. It's a common problem in a lot of food production, like yogurt, right? And so they make a lot of commercial defoamers. And most maple producers use this product called Atmos 3000, which kind of is what it sounds like. It's a thing they make in central Jersey that, it's a chain of diglycerides, I guess. And it's kind of works really well. I mean, it's great. Like you add a couple drops to a vat of syrup and you don't have to worry about foam. We don't use that here. We use organic safflower oil, and 99.9% of this boils off or filters out. It's less than 20 parts per million in a finished jug of maple syrup, but you can test for it. But since it's, kind of synthetic, it's not approved for organic use. It's not on the OMRI list.
Now, when just going to the store and just looking at maple syrup, it's just, how can the consumer tell if what they're looking at is legit?
The most important thing is to look at the label. This is a good question. We get it all the time. It's probably one of the most common questions. It's like, what makes pure syrup pure? What makes real syrup real? Vermonters use real kind of in a condescending way where they say fake syrup. It's not like the sugars from cane or corn or beet are fake sugars. A real maple syrup is a single ingredient product. It is the sap from the tree that has been boiled and reduced and caramelized and turned into syrup. And so what we farm here is really sap. The main product we make is liquid syrup. But as we were nerding out before, you can also take that liquid syrup and you can make other things with it, right? Like candies, or you can make it into a granulated sugar product, or you can make it into a whipped maple cream or maple butter. Yeah. And so the most important thing is to check your ingredients on the back, because there's a huge amount of confusion on maple and sugar in general. A lot of people cut maple syrup, right? So they'll use 98% corn syrup and then they'll put a little bit of maple syrup in it so they can say on the label contains real maple syrup. The FDA allows food companies to use maple as a flavor descriptor and not actual an ingredient.
So like maple syrup flavored?
Yeah, you can say maple flavored products, right? Which is like kind of obscene and silly depending on your perspective, right? Because like you wouldn't make a honey barbecue sauce and not have honey in it, right? But there are folks like the General Mills of the world and the big food companies of the world, crafts of the world, are allowed to use maple and bastardize maple in this way, which has led to a legacy and decades of folks being confused about what is actually real syrup versus what is commonly called like pancake syrups, right? Like the Log Cabins, Hungry Jacks, Aunt Jemimas of the world.
Well, even just going back to the fact on like the cutting of maple syrup, it is so, it's so difficult, again, for them to just understand what the labels, and the companies like Kraft Mills and them, they know that too. It's such an uphill battle just for the labeling and trying to understand. And that's, again, I feel like I say this every time I go to a new farm and ranch, at some point it always brings back to, that's why I say go visit a local farm or ranch, or even if you're not in Vermont and say there's a Vermont farm that's open to you having a phone call, just, we have outsourced our responsibility for everything. That's why it's so awesome that you have the store and you're doing the free tours, because also that takes the barrier entry out of the way. Because say you have somebody who obviously likes maple syrup. I don't know many people that don't like maple syrup. It's pretty dang good. But say they find you all and they want to go visit the tour, but then they're just like, oh, you have to pay. That might seem kind of minuscule, but it's not, to try to get people really interested in all of this and actually take the jump to visit you.
Yeah, well, common question from folks that visit here is, why don't you pay for the tours?
Really?
Yeah, because people have a blast. And like every farm service provider, every farm bureaucrat I talk to says, you need to value your time and value your labor, and you should charge for these tours. And like, sure. But at the same time, like, I don't want to be in the business of selling tours. I want to be in the business of farming, right? And so there's a logical dead end there, right? Where if you start selling tours, then you start, again, we're talking about this earlier, like how capitalism and efficiencies trend towards, like, then you start maximizing how many tour slots you can fit in any one given day so you can get your break even on your tours. I don't want to do that. I just want to sell and spread the good word of maple syrup.
Also, I wonder how many people that did say at the end would have not have gone had they seen they had to pay.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to say, oh, this was such a great trip. How can you not have this why is this for free? It's way easier to say that once you went through it yourself and did the tour.
There's all sorts of knowledge out there, but there are barriers to knowledge, and there's definitely things, right? Like companies that have bigger budgets are able to rig the systems and pay and advertise, right? So that's what you see in your feed, and not what's actually happening on the ground, on farms, behind barn doors. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Are there any other things that, some of these bigger companies have kind of made it confusing for the consumer from your perspective?
I mean, the main thing was what we were talking about, like what's actually in the jug of sugar, right? Other common things that we frequently talk about are like imagery on maple syrup, right? Like lots of people think maple syrup is made in fall foliage when the leaves turn into glitter and fall on the ground. Maple syrup is made in the wintertime or in the late winter, early spring. The imagery around sugaring is still kind of stuck in some sort of Brigadoon past where time froze it, like in the 1940s, right? So the imagery of rusty buckets hanging on trees, maple syrup really isn't made like that anymore. It's made with tubing. I mean, there's all sorts of misconceptions. We can go nerdier about this. Like there was a big controversy 10 years ago where the FDA wanted to put, because of daily nutritional diets, they wanted to put on the jug added sugars, right? So if you look at a nutritional panel, it has a required line for added sugars. Mm-hmm. If the serving amount is over the daily amount of recommended sugar, does that make sense?
Yes, and then they would add the additional as added sugar?
Yeah, so a few years back, they wanted every maple producer to put added sugars on the nutritional panel, which again, like it doesn't help us when we talk about these conversations around, no, this is just pure, this is sugar from the tree. No sugar is added. A lot of people think, oh, when do you add sugar? Do you just dump white sugar in at the end? But that becomes a really hard narrative to break when you have in this case, it's not a big company. It's the U.S. government, which is kind of like a big company, that wanted folks to put added sugars on their label. And that one was fought and won eventually. But it took a lot of lobbying and a lot of testimony and a lot of work by like different trade organizations like the Vermont Sugar Makers Association.
That's what's so tough about agriculture is whenever these are trying to be passed, it is David and Goliath essentially, that you have to have so much backing and support to even stop that. Again, that's also why I'm going at it from the way I am, is the fact that that's constantly already happening from all fronts for agriculture, whether it be the government or Farm Bureau or some other corrupt organizations. It's nonstop. It's nonstop.
Yeah, so some like the big companies out there, they have budgets to hire lobbyists, but farmers don't for the most part. And so they either need to collectivize, right? Like they need to organize, and they need to educate consumers to build movements around the real needs that farmers have that could be helped out through policies and system change, right? And the real needs that eaters have that need to happen through system change and policy change, right? Like we're basically poisoning ourselves with chemically subsidized food every day in America.
I always call it our food-like products, because to me, it's not necessarily there at the food. But going back to, crap, I had my thought here and I just lost it. What were we just talking about?
Added sugars, misconceptions around maple, misconceptions around sugar.
I guess that actually can lead into the whole marketing aspect, because it talked about how quickly you guys have grown the production side, and then now you and Jen are in charge of the shop and the whole marketing retail aspect of all of that. And so I guess, how do you go about all of that, given the industry and what we've just been talking about?
I mean, we try to make genuine connections with people, right? At the end of the day, I think like it's about relationships and about connecting to people where they're at, right? Jen and I are really passionate about the power that small farming can do. We're really passionate about the power that like good food can do, right? Like, so on the back of our jug, we have a quote that says, when you eat good food, you connect to the land, and that's we exist to help you connect to the land, right? And so like when you eat good food, you can taste it and you know that it has a real story behind it that connects to people and land and community. And so we're passionate and lean into that when we do marketing. But it's like anything else. We've tried all of the hustles. I've tried selling syrup on the side of the road on Route 7 with a big spray painted sign. I've tried selling syrup on Etsy. Fun fact, not a whole lot of people buy syrup on Etsy. There's a small population that does. But for the most part, it's like anything else. You learn, you make mistakes, you figure out what works, you figure out who your right audience is connecting to you for a reason, and you lean into that and you listen to people, right? If you're doing something wrong, they'll tell you, or you'll notice eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then what about the customers, say, that aren't in the Northeast or Vermont area, say California or me in Texas? Is that just through what you do online, or how would you?
Yeah,
those folks.
California and Texans love syrup. So generally speaking, because they don't get any syrup, there's no maple farms.
Well, that's why I was asking, because a lot of those areas have none. Yeah.
So we find we do well in communities that are growing like that, right? The Pacific Northwest, California, Florida. Florida loves syrup too. When we are intentionally strategically marketing, we are often looking beyond what I call the maple belts. So for lots of folks, when they think of Vermont, they think of maple. And that's right, because Vermont makes the best maple syrup and it makes the most amount of maple syrup. But maple syrup is actually made from Maine, as far west as Minnesota-ish, as far south as Virginia-ish, right? But if I'm trying to sell syrup to, say, like a trendy brunch spot in Ann Arbor, right, it's a lot more difficult because there's a lot of maple and good maple syrup produced in the state of Michigan. So I'm much more likely to try to find a fancy brunch spot in Austin, Texas. You know those ones?
Oh yeah, they're everywhere. It's literally Austin's brunch. That's synonymous with
breakfast burritos. People down there love their breakfast burritos.
Oh yeah, breakfast burritos, tacos, and brunch. Yeah. too much for me.
And so part of the bigger story of like why maple has quintupled in size in the past 20 years is demand has continued to increase as other sectors have remained flat or shrank, right? Like maple is taking more market share from other sweeteners, right? I was saying before, like corn, cane, and beet is by far the most amount of sugar in an American's diet. But there's other things that are growing too, like honeys and agaves and maple syrup. And people are using maple syrup well beyond pancakes and waffles. That's how most people think of maple syrup, but people are using syrup on a Texas brisket, right? Or they're using it in a stir fry.
I drink it with raw milk all the time.
Drink it with milk.
Oh my gosh, it's so good.
There's a couple places like the local dairy that just went under, Thomas's Dairy. They used to make a maple milk. And you can still see this sometimes in Vermont. Miller Farm does it, is the grape farm. And he makes a maple milk, like a strawberry milk, right?
Yeah.
Or like a chocolate milk that's only sweetened with maple syrup.
See, that's incredible. And actually now, going back to the whole topic of like the maple syrup flavor, because I'm pretty sure our fourth most common ingredient now in America is natural flavors. And that's what's interesting now too, with like the whole marketing aspect. You'll see companies now say no artificial flavors, and I always expect to see natural flavors on the back. And without fail, it is always natural flavors.
Yeah.
And then we have the maple flavor. But then it's interesting as more folks are waking up to all of that madness, waking up to the fact that sugars aren't inherently bad. Honey and maple syrup are good and delicious. And I'm hoping that continues to build, quadruple. I hope that continues with that, because then with humans more using these, then the natural flavors and all the other BS eventually goes away, and we can finally go back to having actual food and not food-like products.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing that irritates the hell out of me, is now any new product I see, I always expect it to have some natural flavors, and typically now it does.
Yeah, I laughed at when you said natural flavors, but that's how I cope with pain, because it's gross, right? And natural has almost no meaning anymore on a food label. It's been bastardized and co-opted. And that's what we run the risk of with like when these large companies take these words away and put, they almost have zero meaning to them, right? And so that's the way organic was headed for a long time, and some people will argue still is, but there's at least a certification program to protect the integrity of the labels around organic. So when you see something that has been USDA certified or organic, or certified by Oregon Tilth, or certified by Vermont organic farmers, like there's a process and compliance around that. And we're starting to see that with regenerative too. What I worry with regenerative is that we create a word that is already starting to get co-opted by big food,
all kinds of flavors,
chemicals.
Yeah,
right. Like they want to take regenerative and turn it into this like, oh, it's no-till, but we're still using tons of herbicides, right? That's not making healthy food. That's not making healthy soils.
And it's misleading whoever would be buying that.
Yeah. So with maple, right, the history behind that, which we didn't really pull apart, but like people started making fake maple syrup a long time ago. And they made it because if you were in Texas, you couldn't get real maple syrup.
I guess, how long are we talking?
Like 100-ish years ago. And the flavor that we associate with fake maple, like maple extract, like there's no real maple extract out there. When you see that being sold on like a baking website, or oftentimes when you buy like maple ice cream, some of it might have some real maple in it, but a lot of it just has maple extract. They derive it from the fenugreek seed. Do you know that one? On the big spice rack. Next time you're on the big spice rack, go open up a bottle right in the middle of HEB and crush it in your hands. And it smells like, they sometimes use it in Mediterranean, Middle Eastern cooking. It smells like log cabin syrup a little bit.
Yeah.
And so that's how they chemically derive that compound.
Holy crap.
And then they started putting it in corn syrup because the government pays people to grow corn in this country, basically, right? And so we've incentivized growing corn, and I love good sweet corn, don't get me wrong. And it does make sense to make sugar from corn because those little kernels are like packed full of sugar, right? What the problem is that we've done that for so long, and we've prioritized efficiencies and ease of farming and chemical farming, right? That we've made food that has been devoid of nutrition, that has been stripped away from everything that held good nutritional value, right? So like all the fiber and all of the nutrition with sugar has been stripped away from it when they use chemical refinement processes. But that story of fake maple is a really old story. And it's something that maple farmers or sugar makers, we call ourselves. We've been having this conversation for a very, 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 very long time, trying to then be able, like, you have to have that conversation first before you can even start talking about, like, why is this good? Why is this better? Why is this healthier? Yeah.
And I would assume that I'm assuming there's some Vermont Maple Syrup Coalition
Yeah, so
type organization.
there's trade organizations, there's farmer organizations, there's a Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association, and there's one for almost every state across the Maple Belt. But the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association, who I'm kind of cheerleading right now because I'm on the board, they are the oldest run agricultural organization, or basically club, in all of the United States. So they've been going on since like the 1800s. And those are the folks that, partially why you think of Vermont maple in your head is because of the work of them creating high integrity, high quality standards, promoting maple as as an identity of Vermont almost. Yeah.
And then when talking on just the actual health of maple syrup, because I'm curious what consumers or when customers come and visit, what they say, just thinking, do they think maple syrup is just inherently unhealthy for them because they hear the word sugar? Because I know that's where we're at now, is a lot of people associate any sugar as unhealthy because we just have so many different kinds, and just where our food system is at now, it's very hard to kind of like parse through that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to eat food from a grocery store that doesn't have gross, ultra processed, ultra refined sugars in it. And so when we talk about the negative side effects of sugar, right? Like in general, yeah, we all probably eat a little too much sugar, right? So all things in moderation. At the same time, like the sugars that are really causing inflammation in the body, right? A lot of these negative side effects. So why a lot of people are pursuing like less sugar in their diets or sugar-free diets comes from our ideas and our feelings around consuming these processed sugars. Maple syrup, right, is an unrefined sugar. So we don't do the gross bleaching of sugars that they use to make white sugar. We're not adding phosphoric acid to sugar to take out impurities like they are. And it's a kind of a different sugar world. There are really good farmers that make things like small batch cane syrup, kind of in the same way I make small batch maple syrup. But the large scale sugaring, that's a different world.
How so?
Well, it's like a commodity farming essentially, right? And so those places, they get paid by pounds that they sell. Sugar cane is problematic for a number of reasons, because lots of times after you cut it, it's burnt. It's pretty devastating for wetlands. When we talk about maple syrup, for the most part, we're talking about keeping big trees in the ground, right? Like carbon sinks that are like, we know trees are what make us all possible to live on this world because they take in carbon dioxide, they put out oxygen, and sugar makers kind of have a symbiotic relationship with their woods, right? We're all about having small trees get bigger, right? And making our living with those trees. Otherwise, those trees are open for development to get logged or turned into housing lots. So if you go further west in the Maple Belt, you see losing woodlands, right? Because people will cut down maple trees. They're a valuable tree for floors and furniture and everything else.
Is that an issue to where there's a lot, especially because it's also interesting on just real estate and just land as a whole, because that's also a thing in America to where a lot of powerful players are starting to, they've always understood the value, but now the value of just land itself has skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And there was the land sell-off that got pushed from, I believe, Mike Lee from the Pacific Northwest area, and that got a lot of backlash online and eventually got dropped. But I feel like that could be a huge problem too, given what you just described of seeing the value of just taking out the trees and just repurposing it. Is that a current problem or?
Yeah, so like people that look at the long-term growth and health of the maple industry really want to have us think long-term about what are we planning to do in terms of land use, both at the state level, but also at the local level. All of these things are really important. And so we touched a little briefly on our tour about the history of Vermont. Vermont used to be clear cut, and a lot of what Vermont has regrown in the past 150 years. Now it's just that trend has just tipped backwards. And so Vermont was 80% woodlands a few years ago. Now it's maybe 75% woodlands, right? And then for all the woods that are cut to build another housing lot, most in Greater Burlington, you lose the potential of somebody tapping those trees for maple syrup. In 1919, 100 some years ago, back when Sarah Baird bought this farm from her sister, there was almost as much maple syrup made in 1919 in the state of Vermont as there was made in 2019. So literally every tree in the state of Vermont had a bucket hanging on it, right? There was that, like every family made maple sugar. It was a way of life, right? And now the production dipped throughout the turn of the century as it was a difficult thing to do. And now we're kind of on the rise again. I think we just passed those early production numbers.
Do you know when maple syrup was first, harvested in America?
It's very old. So people like the Abenaki people and native people always made maple syrup. And then Vermont was kind of settled. I say this sometimes, so don't say this to another Vermonter, they might not like it. Vermont was kind of settled by a bunch of rich kids from Connecticut. So like that,
I guarantee that's not given that.
The Green Mountain Boys, or some people know the Green Mountain Boys, like Ethan Allen and Ira Allen. Those were like dudes that built big forts and fought the British. Those are the guys that kind of came up from Connecticut and settled the land. And so native peoples taught European folks how to make sugar. And it's like the first reference is really early. You can't quote me on this, but I think it was like 1608. Because it was seen as an early way of making a living. People love sugar back then. They still do, clearly. But sugar also makes alcohol, right? And they also drank a lot back then. And it was an early way of getting good sugar made off the land, because everyone was a subsistence farmer back then. And you would tap trees with wooden buckets hanging on trees, and you would boil them, and basically like you'd have a sugar camp out in the woods, and it was a whole family affair to just make the sugar crop in the springtime. And then as it's grown, it's become part of a larger agricultural diversification. So you had people sugaring on the side as they ran sheep or as they dairied cows. And now it's become a thing to its own. So it's not until like relatively recent history when you can make syrup as your main revenue. One way I sometimes say the story of like the first sugar maker is like a squirrel. Because if you see like a broken branch on a tree, sometimes it will drip sap. And if you see, sometimes there's a squirrel there chewing and feasting on the sap. And so there's probably somebody like way, 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 way back that looked at that squirrel and said, I can be that squirrel. I can eat that sap. You know how some people are like sacrificial goats of the universe? Yeah, someone like that did it.
And then actually, I want to talk on the actual benefits of maple syrup. For someone that might not know, what are some actual health benefits to it? Because there are legit ones.
So, the best thing is that it's an unrefined sugar that like your body was built to digest this thing, right? So it's lower on the glycemic index. It doesn't peak your sugars like other sugars do. It has all sorts of trace minerals, manganese, zinc, right? All of these things. And it's packed full of antioxidants. Those are just like a quick snapshot of what we think about when we think about like the nutritional snapshot of maple syrup. Beyond that, right, like we compared it to all of these other processed sugars. We talked about how it's much better for the environment, right? It's much better for working landscapes in Vermont. And for the most part, when you buy pure maple syrup at the grocery store, even if it's probably going through a third-party packer or an aggregator, it's coming from relatively still small farms. We've talked a little bit about how there's this new advent of very large maple farms. For the most part, maple farms are family operated scale operations. Yeah.
And then with the smaller than the bigger scale, because with every industry now in agriculture, a lot of it has been captured from a very few big players. Has that happened in maple syrup to where because as we were talking again in the tour earlier, I mentioned like the dairies and hogs, but then it's happening with the cattle. It's happened with the chicken industry. I was just curious to hear on the maple syrup industry.
You see it a little bit. You see it some on the processing and equipment. You see, so one, on the whole, like farms have consolidated over time. You have less farms. You have fewer number of farms that are bigger farms, right? Because it's a little bit of like you got to get big or go home. It's very hard to find your niche and be successful as a small operator, whether you're milking cows or making maple. When we talk about like consolidation at the processor level, so like in maple industry, we have these things called co-packers. Like when I sell bulk syrup, a lot of syrup, if you're buying syrup at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or the Costco's of the world, it's coming from 4 or 5 large players. Those guys they're not all evil, like big food. A lot of them are maple farms that in the 50s, their grandparents got really good at selling syrup. So they started buying from their neighbors and their neighbors' neighbors and their neighbors' neighbors' neighbors. And all of a sudden they're selling to Safeways of the Pacific Northwest. In many ways, those places that aggregate the crop are responsible for why maple has grown, and it's given a huge amount of economic viability to small producers. At the same time, like I'm thinking of one in particular, one of those companies just a couple years ago got bought out by a giant Canadian corporation that also just makes all sorts of sugar. It's called LB Rogers, right? And so that is like a vertical integration, right, in which they are trying to dominate and control all sorts of sweeteners, right? Because they have the funds and the expertise and the know-how and the financing to enable a huge amount of consolidation, right?
And they can use their power to use their nice marketing tactics to mislead the public back to them. That's the one thing I just noticed so much. But that's what's also interesting with maple syrup, because it is much more unique given the fact that you can't harvest this any state you want, because you can grow cattle or a different animal or certain like potatoes everywhere around America. But here, again, in Texas, you can't. And so it's interesting on the fact that even though some of those big players are still kind of doing that, the fact that the market continues to grow because of the fact that the supply and demand, the demand just will continue. To me, the demand will continue to skyrocket given, I think it will be. I should say I hope so.
It has been great for like a sector. And don't quote me on these numbers, but I've heard numbers like 10 to 15%. The entire industry, just consumption is growing. Like people are buying more syrup, which is healthy growth for an industry-wide sector. There's all sorts of reasons to be concerned about what big money and big capital and big financing is doing. There's all things to be concerned about on the manufacturing end of things. So when we looked at steel drums or steel tanks or evaporators, America has almost lost all of that manufacturing when it comes to like making these pieces of equipment. There's a couple smaller manufacturers still in the United States that do really good work. The one that was really touting itself as like American made got bought out by a Canadian corporation 2 years ago. So there's just like a huge amount of that. Quebec makes a huge amount of maple syrup and they're able to dominate the industry. And a lot of what we've seen for growth is also international growth. So almost all of the maple syrup made in America stays in America. Plus the Canadians then fill in the other gap of about half of our maple consumption gets brought down over the Canadian border. But then like all of the growth, when we think about like if you're in a fancy pancake house in Switzerland or India, right? Like it's usually coming from the Canadian crop. The Canadians are really moving towards exporting more syrup where it makes sense.
Do we have enough to where we could easily just supply all of Americans with just American maple syrup?
Somebody asked me this question the other day. I think you could get close, but it would involve a lot more maple farms, right? Or hopefully a lot more maple farms or a lot more people tapping the same maple farms growing and growing and growing. Michigan has the largest amount of untapped sugar maple trees right now. And so if you want to grow up and be a sugar maker, move to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Northern Maine, they make a lot of syrup in northern Maine, way back in the sticks, oftentimes where there's no power, right? And they run off-grid sugar houses, really big sugar houses. New York, the New York State has grown a lot, mostly in the upper Adirondacks. So Vermont makes the most amount of maple syrup in the United States. We think maybe 53%. Then New York is number 2, then Maine is number 3. But a lion's share of maple syrup is made in this tiny, tiny state, which is Vermont's like essentially 250 villages, right? But everyone and their brother makes maple syrup. Yeah.
Now I'm curious too, would people be able to try to plant those trees in non-native areas in America and just try to start growing their own maple syrup?
You kind of can. Like you can grow maple trees and you can tap other maple trees too to basically make the same maple syrup. We talked about tapping like red maple trees, Norwegian maple trees, striped maple trees, box elders, which is kind of like a black sheep cousin of maple trees, let's say. You can tap box elder trees. The problem is you really need a freeze thaw cycle, or you need at least cold weather and warm weather, because that's what creates the sap runs and sap flows. And so sugar makers will often say cold nights and warm days. That's why we make syrup here in the month of March, because we have that freeze thaw cycle, and you just don't have it as much in like North Carolina. I know one sugar maker in North Carolina. I know a dude in Georgia who made syrup on his backyard trees. But again, like you're not going to get the pronounced volumes and flows that you really need to do it at any sort of commercial scale.
Now, you're talking on the freezing and thawing. What about something like the humidity? Because as we were walking, it was clear how humid it is here. Does that play in a part too?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure. Like a high pressure or low pressure day makes an effect on your sap run. I don't know if I've seen any studies on humidity. Some people talk about the cycles of the moon, all right?
Yeah.
The moon controls the tide. So you think like on a full moon that you might get a big sap run.
We just had one.
Yeah, we did have. There's a sap moon in March, right? And we usually make a lot of syrup on that day. We made syrup on the total eclipse of the sun last year. It was strong.
Yeah.
It was at the end of the season. So did you see the eclipse last year?
No, but I remember.
Because it went outside of Texas. Were you in Texas?
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
they had some festival just right outside of where I was at.
Yeah. So we made syrup here that day and came out okay, I guess.
The last thing I wanted to talk to was just more on the whole policy aspect too, because as we were talking on the tour, you said there's some good, I guess, rules in place, but then also some not so good ones. And so I was curious, are there areas to where it's like over-regulated to where you can't do something that you need to do, or try to have, say, the foundation set up for a maple syrup farm?
So these are just my personal opinions, right? So I was talking about how like Vermont literally has maple laws on the books, on statute law, and they've had them for like 100 years. And partially that has been really good in effectively like creating a product integrity, reducing the amount of adulteration and cutting of maple syrup. Like that stuff happens in honey world a lot, right?
Oh,
like
yeah.
there's a lot of honey that gets messed with and cut. You don't see that as much with maple. And partially those rules are really important for protecting the quality and food safety of syrup. Sometimes when we talk specifically like around things around food safety and compliance, right? Like if we all did what the FDA wanted us to do, farmers in general, if we all did everything to the letter of the law, all of us would be out of business like a long, long time ago. And so there are huge, when we talked about this before, like barriers of access, barriers to accessing land, barriers to making your own food. In general, that's like, again, it's always a really fine line, right? And definitely regulations can sometimes go over that line. Where I want to see people taking power and in charge of their own food. If you believe in like the food sovereignty movement,
Yes.
right? Like producers should have the power and capacity, and they have the knowledge to make food for themselves and their communities in a healthy way, right? And producers like me, like I'm all about making the cleanest, most food safe product as possible, right? Because that's what I want to do. That's what I'm incentivized to do anyways. But it gets tough out there, right? Because if you're no longer to buy, if you can't buy certain types of metal or old equipment, right? Like a lot of people are just trying to get into the industry, and it's an expensive industry to get into when you start calculating how much it costs to buy everything in stainless steel, right? Which is the safest metal to work with, like things add up. So there's a real fine line there between allowing people to have control over their own products and feeding themselves, and making sure that government is there to protect the integrity of a product, but not overstep in a way that is overbearing on producers, where they feel like they're getting priced out. Like you can't even participate, or you can't even be a farmer, because if I'm not a big farmer, I can't exist.
I guess my next question then would be, what's probably one of the most challenging aspects that you currently face at this maple syrup farm?
So Jen and I are trying to do like really intentional growth, which is tough. There's a lot of farms in Vermont that like become more gift shop than farm, because we're using agritourism as a vehicle to have people connect to the land and connect to the farm. So it's really tough to like not have giant bus tours, or not have, like knickknacks and stuff, right? But I don't want to sell knickknacks. So we're trying to intentionally stay more farmy than gift shop. And we have a market that's growing. So we're tapping more trees this year. I have access to a couple hundred more trees. We're gonna tap those. We're gonna make a tiny bit more syrup. But we want to set a goal for how big we want to be, like 10, 15 years from now, and plan and build for that, and not have like unfettered growth because of all of the things we talked about earlier, right? Like when you just grow for growth's sake, right, you lose a little bit of all the other benefits that you end up looking over when you do things for the sake of efficiency, or when you do things for the sake of scale, or when you do things for the sake of, just getting big, right?
You might lose why you did it in the first place too, because I notice it all the time with companies and startups, to where they've started focusing on all that, lost the mission or identity, and it's kind of hard to bring that back.
Yeah. It's like that Nietzsche quote, beware of those who go out into the abyss of seeking monsters, lest you become a monster yourself. You know that one?
No, but it reminds me of the famous Batman quote of, you live long enough to come to, how is it? Now I can't remember.
Another one. I know
you live
Die a hero.
Yeah, you either die here, you either die here or live long enough to come to villain.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to think of, are there any other topics that I might have missed or anything on just covering maple syrup? Because I'm kind of the consumer right now too, visiting you all, and I didn't know if there's anything else that I've missed.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We've covered a huge span of topics, right? And all of these things are happening all at once, right? And at the end of the day, like something I impress upon folks coming from other farming industries is maple exists in this really unique kind of cooperative environment, partially because it's still growing. Like things are competitive in Vermont at like the general store level, like if we're all trying to sell to the general store. But for the most part, like it's not like candy world. In candy world, people sign NDAs before you go into Hershey's to make M&Ms, right? It's all trade secrets. In maple world, maple farmers are all about collaborating and having like a rising tide lifts all boats. Like we want to all become better sugar makers.
Yeah.
And that's partially because of the culture around maple, but it's also partially because of the growth around maple. It's partially because of the Canadians too. Like we could all sell every last drop of maple syrup we make here almost to the same 4 companies and not have to fight over price and competition and it's not like carrots at the local farm stand, right? There's only so many carrots your local co-op can sell. Does that make sense?
It sure does.
And so that has led to this really unique culture around maple, around collaboration, around community, right? That you just don't often see with other types of ag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that partly, because I'm just curious too, overall, what has made you just so passionate about all of this. It was just clear whenever we were out there visiting the field, but from the consumers, they just might just see a bunch of tubes around trees and we got a sugar house. But compared to, say, riding a horse trying to gather cattle, they might not understand how you could be so passionate about this.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, you're making sugar from trees. So it's like the coolest thing in the world, right? Like if you're a little boy that grows up in the Northeast, like you run out into or whatever, Vermont, you run out into the woods and you build little forts and stuff. And we get to do that pretty much every day. You know, we get to work in the woods. We get to work with our hands, making meaningful things that people, I said this before, like it's a part of identity in Vermont, right? But like we get to connect with like whatever. You met Jody earlier. She brings her empty jars here and we fill them up for her, right? And that connection, right? Like connecting to other people and having them help connect to the land, right? That's like the fuel to the fire here. That's what gets us up every morning, doing it all over again.
I love that.
Yeah.
And then going back to, I should have talked more on the whole regenerative too, because that was another thing I was thinking on. Comparing the organic and regenerative, especially in the context of a maple syrup farm being out in the woods, how do people, if they want to do regenerative, what would they even be looking into?
So there's different certifications, right, for all sorts of different things. We talked about organic certification, right? There are people moving towards regenerative certifications, like there's the Regenerative Alliance, and they have regenerative certifications for all sorts of sectors like beef and veg. Mm-hmm. There is none for maple.
Well, that's why I was curious, because there's really not, and I was just wondering if there's any systems or practices to where you implement just in this versus, again, a monocrop farm.
Yeah, so right now, like probably the standard bearer for making sure people are doing their best practices, and it's like anything else, like there's a lot of great organic vegetable farmers out there that grow their crops organic, but they're not getting certified.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, that was the farm I worked on. It wasn't certified, but it was all organic and it was regenerative as well.
And so like that's great. Like everybody has a different system that works for them. What you have when you have a product that is certified organic, right, at the end of the day is like accountability and compliance, that you know that these things are grown. And like to their benefit, I'm also on the organic review committee for Vermont organic farmers. So I mean, I'm cheerleading a little bit, but at the same time, like there's no substantive. Most maple farmers will say there's no real difference between organic and conventional maple trees, right? Like they're both coming from the same tree. There's nuances in different processing aids, like we talked about defoamers, right, which are important. And when we talked about like tapping guidelines and annually inspected things like biodiversity threshold indexes and forest management plans, the organic people are really the only people that are walking through the woodlands of Vermont talking about forest management and sugar bush health. Whether you're doing it or not, they're the only people that actually like have a system of compliance around it. And for some of these regenerative programs, you know, they often have it as like an add-on. So you're required to be certified organic, or you're required to have animal welfare, right? Or you're required to have some other thing. And then the regenerative certification is above and beyond that. And the people that would create those guidelines would be folks from usually the certified organic world, right? And so there's a lot there to pull apart, and there's a lot more work to do. But there is a wide varying of scale of how people treat their land and how people treat their woods and how people treat their product, right? When we talk about making it in a good, clean environment and integrity of product.
What makes a good, clean environment?
I mean, I know some sugar makers that make really good syrup in dirt floor sugar houses, right? But if you looked at those sugar houses, just from a consumer point of view, you'd be like, yeah, like most people probably wouldn't be okay with this level of food safety standards, right? So again, like, I don't know if anybody's actually done a study whether a sugar sap tank out in the woods that's uncovered, right, that can get leaf debris in it, is really more unhealthy than a sap tank out in the woods that has a cover on it. Most regulators require, it's in Vermont state law, the organic folks too, like require sap tanks to be covered. But we were talking about this the other day, like, is there actually a study that says this is more healthy because it is covered? And it comes from a particular little bit of law compliance around making sure there's no opportunities for contamination. And that's where like covering tanks comes from. But this is what happens when you go down these nerdy policy rabbit holes, when it's like, oh, we made these rules based off of a certain law that had good intentions, but all of a sudden, like, are we just doing things for compliance sake, or are we doing things because we want to make good, clean products that can feed our children?
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
And we're in like the whole world of this is all gray area and all nuance. The most important thing as an informed consumer is to get to know your farmer, go to the local farm stand, go to the farmer's market, show up at a farm and learn about where your food comes from.
Could not agree more. And so for you, since, you know, you didn't, you weren't raised on this farm though, but obviously you're well ingrained now. What has been one of your favorite memories looking back?
The all-nighters are kind of fun. They're kind of miserable. You know how people get pleasure from pain? I'm kind of one of those guys. We had one the other year, and it was like the sap was dumping in, and for some reason, Bob is coming up the road from one of these pump houses. We were talking about beavers before.
Yeah.
And he's driving up the road, and he's like, I think I saw a beaver, which is strange. There's beavers way up the road, but it would be strange that a beaver is down there. And we're like, there's no way you saw a beaver in the middle of a snowstorm in April. But I guess he did really see a beaver. But we still tease him to that to this day. There's also an oak tree that he tapped for many years. I make fun of him for that. Yeah. It's hard to tell when the leaves are down, I guess, you know?
Yeah. With maple syrup, it also just helps the consumer try new products that they might not think that they'd like. Like milk, for example, is so nutritious, but a lot of the stuff that you buy in stores is complete garbage. And so speaking of like Vermont, I know a lot of clothes, but there's so much good dairy. And then if you just add some maple syrup in it.
Yeah, really good.
It's so good.
Vermonters like these things called creamies. And maple is a popular flavor. Some of them use fake extract still. But like a lot of them, like a real maple creamy, it's very good. It's just like it's a higher butterfat content soft serve ice cream that has maple syrup in it.
Dang. And see, that's the thing. You would have not noticed had you actually gone to a farm. And that's why I'm going to end on this by you always should, as a consumer, shake the hand that feeds you.
Oh, thanks for coming out, man.
Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.